Hello YouTube. In some of my videos I present the fabulous and bloody history of Russia of the 18th century. To be sure, the paranormal history of the Russian Empire in one of the key periods in its past. I already made several videos about the 18th century, about the Russia's secret chancellery that investigated supernatural cases, about a very unusual clairvoyant, and also about the Arzamas monster. You can find those videos in my channel. The next one will be about the most unusual person in the Russian history of the 18th century. Really a human with superior abilities and knowledge. But today we will look at a very unusual museum in Russia, and it's in St. Petersburg. And the most excellent and great sovereign, Emperor Pyotr Alexeyevich, the ruler of all Russias, or Tsar Peter I, who would subsequently be called the Great after his death in 1725. He was one of Russia's most energetic and active rulers. Throughout his life, he tried his hand at various crafts and skills, learning engineering, architecture, and shipbuilding. At the same time, he ruled his country with an iron fist. In August 1697, a young Tsar, king, we call it Tsar or Tsar, better pronunciation for English-speaking people, Tsar Peter I embarked on a 2-year journey around Europe. Not a fan of Russian traditionalism, upon his return to the motherland, Peter started to rapidly force Russia to accept European ways, paying no attention to any resistance or complaints. His Imperial Majesty Peter I, the Emperor and Autocrat of all Russia. The Kunstkamera is one of the main attractions of St. Petersburg. This is the traditional name of the Peter the Great Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography of the Russian Academy of Sciences. There are many shocking facts associated with the museum. The Kunstkamera owes its appearance to the sincere desire of Peter I for enlightenment. It was his personal collection of oddities and unusual natural phenomena that became the basis for the creation of the Russian Academy of Sciences, the Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography, and several academic museums. The name Kunstkamera comes from the German word Kunst. The first exhibits of the museum collection were bought in 1714 by Peter I from the Dutch embalmer, Professor Frederick Ruisch. Basically, these were alcohol-soaked samples of various physical pathologies. For example, two-headed babies and other carriers of congenital deformities. There are many preparations of the internal human organs in the collection. There are also mummified exhibits. Until now, more than 900 Ruisch preparations have been preserved without any special changes, and many of them have not lost their scientific value. The teratological collection includes human freaks, conjoined wings in the head, chest, abdomen, back, pelvis, two-faced Janus-shaped freaks with one-eyed cyclops, with a hair lip, with an undivided brain, with one leg, sirens, etc. As well as animals, for example, a two-headed calf, a chicken with 4 legs, etc. Anatomists of that time who studied monsters, the term they used, worked in the round hall, the anatomical theater of the lower floor of the Kunstkamera. There were also reports and debates of academic anatomists that were held there. Because Peter, our Tsar, was interested in the practical application of anatomy surgery, he himself carried out some simple operations there. The museum contains medical and anatomical instruments used by the sovereign. He often removed teeth from different people. The collection of teeth pulled out by Peter I has survived to this day. For the first time, the exhibition was open to the public viewing in the green study of the Summer Garden, and in 1718 it was transferred to the Kikin house on Vasilievsky Island. We will get into that a little bit later. But the people were not very eager to consider the rarities. There were rumors that the seal of the Antichrist was on them, and anyway, there was an evil spirit in the museum premises. They said, for example, that the shadows of the exhibits are separated from the objects and move independently around the hall. The Kunstkamera, as a collection of all kinds of rarities, was originally conceived by Peter the Great basically to educate everyone. Curiosities and artifacts, ancient and rare things, were brought to the Russian Czar from all over Russia and from abroad, and Peter himself brought many valuable exhibits for his collection from his many trips abroad. This collection soon grew so much that it began to displace its inhabitants from the royal palace, and it was decided to look for a special building or facility to accommodate it. So the next habitat of the collection of the amazing exhibits was the so-called Kikin house, the mansion of the disgraced Russian nobleman Kikin. The first head of the Admiralty, who was also a confidant of Tsarevich or Prince Alexei Petrovich, did not really have time to live here. And the story of such a misunderstanding is quite simple. Peter I had a new, now the most beloved son from Catherine I, and he called him Peter Petrovich. Peter's personal life turned out to be no less turbulent than his public life. His oldest son Alexei, who was born by his cloistered wife Yevdokia, grew up to loathe his father and all his reforms. Peter, meanwhile, had fallen for a low-born woman, the future Empress Catherine I, who bore him other children and whom he married in 1712. The emperor loved the new son. He considered the boy to be the main heir to the royal throne, thereby excluding Alexei from the inheritance and forcing him to become a monk, thereby personally renouncing his rights to the throne. To Alexei, life without parties, wine, champagne, and ladies, and moreover with a tonsure in the monastery, did not seem sweet and beautiful. With the help of Kikin, he decided to escape to Poland all the way to Sicily, where he began to drink wine in the hope that Peter, who was ill, would die soon in the cold climate of northern Russia, and Alexei would victoriously regain the throne with the support of the Austrian army. Alexei, suspected of plotting to overthrow his father and undo his undertakings, fled Russia. But Alexei was taken back to St. Petersburg and was to be executed as a traitor to the motherland. He was charged with high treason, tortured and condemned to death, dying in prison before the execution. At the same time, Alexander Kikin was executed, broken on the wheel for organizing the escape of the prince, and his house was confiscated by the treasury. Thereby, in 1718, the museum exhibits were moved to the house of the disgraced Kikin. Peter I decided to adopt it for the Kunstkamera and a library. Everything gathered here was duly established and arranged from the official language, and by the highest order it was ordered to everyone who wants to, let them watch and drive, showing and explaining things. Since that time, the items stored in the royal collections have become available for public viewing. For the most distinguished guests, Peter I himself became a guide, since no one knew all the exhibits of the collection better than him. Now you imagine, strange exhibits are located in the house of the executed nobleman, and the Czar himself leads the tours. Is it worth mentioning that the ghost of the executed Kikin repeatedly visited the Kunstkamera while it was located in his former house? But people of Russia were in no hurry to visit his auspicious palace, and it was located on the outskirts. After the opening of the Kunstkamera in the Kikin house in 1719, actually, Pavel Yaguzhinsky proposed to make the entrance to the exhibition to be paid, but the emperor was better aware of the moods and motives of his subjects. The flow of people wishing to join science and knowledge increased significantly after the Czar ordered to distribute to all those who came a glass of vodka, coffee for non-drinkers, and a glass of Hungarian white wine for the noble public. They say that many ladies even began to complain that their spouses disappear for the whole days in the Kunstkamera. The halls of the Grand Palace of Kikin allowed to expand the museum's expositions in all their diversity. In those years, by the way, the museum consisted of several permanent premises. Naturkamera, exhibits related to natural sciences, including the anatomical hall with the freaks of Frederick Rouge. Münzkamera, ancient coins and medals were displayed here. Kunstkamera, expositions of household items from different continents and works of art of peoples of different countries. The Sovereign Study is a collection of the emperor himself, which was collected in different years. Of particular interest in the Museum of Peter the Great era were the living monsters, as they were referred to at the time. They were people with unusual anatomical abnormalities and shocking features. They lived at the museum and were comprehensively studied by scientists. With their unusual appearance, they invariably aroused the increased interest of visitors. For example, the skeleton of Nicolas Bourgeois. Once, while traveling in Europe, Peter I met a giant Frenchman named Nicolas Bourgeois. His height was 226.7 centimeters or 7 feet and 44 inches. The emperor, as a lover of collecting all sorts of wonders, immediately hired the Bourgeois to his service. In 1724, Bourgeois died of apoplexy, and his skeleton, as well as his heart, were placed in the Kunstkamera. And the same year, Bartolomeo Carlo Rastrelli made a movable figure, a mannequin made of wood, and then covered it with the giant's skin. Until the end of the 18th century, the figure was in the Kunstkamera. The skeleton of the giant also became an exhibit of the Kunstkamera. However, in the major fire in 1747, the skull of Bourgeois burned down and had to be replaced with the skull of another person. One of the legends says that during the fire, the skeleton of Bourgeois lost its head and the other skull was attached to it, but since then the giant's ghost has been roaming the halls, searching for the lost body part. And now let's look at another resident, and this was the dwarf Fyodor Ignatiev. He lived in the Kunstkamera for 16 years as an exhibit. Fyodor was 122 centimeters tall, slightly over 4 feet. And besides, he was a freak. Ignatiev had only 2 fingers on his right hand and on his feet. It seemed that these were not human limbs, but claws. According to the stories, Tsar Peter, appearing in the Kunstkamera, visiting, always personally greeted the dwarf by handshake. After Peter's death, a new spacious building was constructed for the Kunstkamera in 1734. But in 1747 there was a fire there. Many exhibits were destroyed. Some of them, saving them from the fire, the attendants threw out on the street, where the museum goods were irrevocably stolen by passer-by people. The remaining exhibits were transported to the nearby houses of rich Russian factory and landowners, Demidov and Stroganov. Only at the end of 1766 the building was repaired, and the exposition returned to its rightful place. And the tower was rebuilt only 200 years after the fire. Subsequently, people came up with the idea that the fire was set again by the otherworldly forces that took over the museum. The final place of residence of the Kunstkamera was Vasilievsky Island, where the first Russian museum moved to in 1927. According to the legend, the place for construction was chosen by Peter the Great himself, having seen two surprisingly fused pine branches on the bank of the Neva River. Unusual trees were added to the collection of the Kunstkamera, and a new museum building was laid on the place where they grew. Throughout the history of the Kunstkamera, from its foundation to the present day, museum staff have complained about the presence of ghosts and other otherworldly forces. This is not surprising, because in addition to human embryos, unusual skeletons and other ugly exhibits that once belonged to the human race, there are many amulets, talismans, cult objects of different people with different energies. But let's look at some of the exhibits. Let's look at this one, a child's skeleton with two heads. The author of the creepy statuette and one of the first exhibits of the Kunstkamera is the Dutch anatomist and botanist and embalmer Frederik Ruijs. His anatomical preparations were famous throughout Europe. In the collection All Works on Anatomy, Medicine and Surgery, the scientist wrote about his other find, the skeleton of a 4-month-old human fetus holding in its hand a bunch of water vessels I extracted from that body 25 years ago, inflated it with air, and preserved in such a way that the valves are still clearly visible. How much effort is hidden behind these beautiful objects? So during the visit to Amsterdam with the Grand Embassy, Peter I visited Ruijs' office and was so amazed at the sight of the corpse of a child, which was preserved so well that it seemed alive and with a smile on his lips, that he could not refrain from kissing it. The Czar communicated with the scientist, dined with him, and attended his lectures. And 20 years later, he bought several thousand exhibits from his collection. Look at this one. A flute made of human bone. In Tibet, it was a tradition to make flutes from the femur tibia of a person. Such instruments were called ganlin, from the words femur and flute. According to shamans, the best material for such a flute was a part of the leg of a teenager from a family of Brahmanists, followers of God Absolute. The bones of criminals were also suitable, as well as people who died a violent death or from an infectious disease. Ganlin is used when performing the Chod rite, one of the schools and practices of Tibetan Buddhism, together with a drum made of two skulls. Shamans from Mongolia used the flute to summon the spirits of the three worlds, while it was forbidden to blow into the instrument just like that. The Boat of Heaven, that's another exhibit, an unusual toy a boat on the deck of which you can see the patterned deity made of amber, surrounded by a noble traveler and his servants, dancers and musicians made of ivory. The hull of the boat is made of wood and sheeted with ivory and tin. 3 wheels are hidden in the bottom. If you start a special mechanism with the key, the boat will start moving and the servants will dance and play instruments. The heavenly boat is called in memory of the Emperor Yingzhang, who lived in the 3rd century BC. The great founding emperor Qin often thought about the issues of immortality and sent expeditions into the unknown, whose mission was to find islands with the inhabitants of heaven. The emperor believed that the immortals travel for fun on the seas of time on such boats. You can check out my videos about ancient China. I have a few mentions about the emperor and his undertakings. The toy has been kept in the Kunstkammer since 1720. It was brought by Russian ambassadors from Beijing. After the fire of 1747, it was believed that there were practically no exhibits of Peter the Great era in the Kunstkammer, but it was still possible to find the boat. It was restored and put on display for visitors. Is it indestructible? Let's look at another exhibit, okay? Arsenius' astrolabe. Even in ancient Greece, the astrolabe was used to determine the position of the stars and orient themselves in space. In the Middle Ages, the best instruments that were taken the stars were made by the Arabs, and the Europeans skillfully copied them. In Europe, their own astrolabes began to be designed by the 16th century. One of the best masters of this period was the Flemish Gualteris Arsenius. He left behind 21 astrolabes. The astronomical instrument created in 1568 belonged to Albrecht von Wallenstein, one of the prominent Austrian generals of the 30 Years' War. It was this astrolabe that was presented to the Imperial Public Library in St. Petersburg. In the 19th century, it was owned by the Grand Duchess Elena Pavlovna, from whose collection it got into the Kunstkammer. The pommel of the astrolabe is decorated with the image of a female and male faun, who in ancient mythology had the gift of foresight. By the way, these tools were kept by noble people along with jewelry and were a sign of special prosperity. Look at the Gottorp globe. The first and once the largest globe planetarium in the world is one of the most famous exhibits of the Kunstkammer. This globe is not simple. A map of the Earth is drawn on its outer surface, and the sky and stars are drawn on the inner surface. You can also climb into it. The diameter of the sphere is 3 meters. The weight is 3.5 tons. The Gottorp globe is named after Gottorp Duke Frederick III, who commissioned it. And the author of the project is an outstanding cartographer, Adam Olearius. In 1713, the bishop administrator of the Duchy of Gottorp, Christian August, gave the globe to the St. Petersburg as a diplomatic gift to Peter I. Shipping by sea and land took 3 years. Before the fire of 1747, the collection of the oldest museum in Russia had truly amazing exhibits, the loss of which was absolutely impossible to make up for. For example, fans of geography and astronomy could be pleased with that globe planetarium. It was possible to enter the globe through a special hatch and at least enjoy the rotation of mysterious celestial bodies for hours. Unfortunately, this unique exhibit was destroyed in that fatal fire of 1747, and it had to be restored using a metal frame. After it was restored, they renamed it the Big Academic Globe. The copy turned out to be quite successful, so during the Nazi Germany's blockade of the Soviet city of Leningrad, as St. Petersburg was known in the Soviet times, in order to preserve it, it was even taken out of the city. And today it can be seen on the 4th floor of the Kunstkammer. At the beginning of the 20th century, again, the globe was located in the Tsarskaya Selo, and then from there it was stolen by the Nazis. It was returned in 1948. Paleolithic Venus. Paleolithic Venuses is a generalizing name for the figurines of the Upper Paleolithic era, 40 to 12,000 years ago. Usually, these figurines were carved from bones, tusks, and soft rocks of stone. There are preserved Venuses sculpted from clay and then burned, which is one of the oldest examples of ceramics. By the beginning of the 21st century, more than 100 Venus were known. Most of them are small, from 4 to 25 centimeters in height. The figurines usually depict women, often obese and pregnant. According to one version, one account, Venus is an image of the ancestral goddess, a symbol of fertility. And the other account says that there are amulets or images of real women. The figurine, about 22,000 years old, which can be seen in the Kunstkamera, is made of a mammoth tusk. It was excavated near the village of Kostenki in 1936, where in ancient times there were campsites of ancient people. I wonder what else they found at that village, and we should look at it one way, but one day. There are several legends about the artifacts stored in the Kunstkamera that have mystical power. For example, there's a clock in mahogany case, the hands of which are usually immobile, but allegedly, sometimes they suddenly start moving backwards, always stopping at the same position, 9 hours and 45 minutes. And after that, as a rule, someone from the museum staff dies. Another cursed exhibit is a statuette of a bronze cat. They say that from time to time the cat blinks, and if someone is present, then he or she will soon die. So one student decided to spend the night in the pantry next to the notorious statuette, and the next morning no one was found in the pantry, only the cat was grinning ominously. The young man was never seen again. Another legend says that once in the storerooms of the Kunstkamera, or the vaults, there were two glass vessels. Each of them contained a human head in an alcohol solution. One allegedly belonged to the Russian official and lover of Catherine I, William Mons, who was beheaded by Peter I. William, by the way, was also the brother of the emperor's lover, Anna Mons. And the other head belonged to the ex-favorite of Peter I, Maria Hamilton, who was beheaded for killing her own child, born, however, not from the royal lover, but from his orderly Ivan Orlov. Hamilton, also as a lady in waiting to the empress, stole her jewelry. So let's look at it. After executing his wife's lover, Peter allegedly forced her to look at his head impaled on a pole. As for Lady Hamilton, again, she was a lady in waiting to Empress Catherine. So in addition to Peter the Great, she had affairs with his orderly Ivan Orlov. 3 times Maria became pregnant by Orlov. Twice she managed to get rid of the fetus, but on the 3rd it did not work out, and she killed the newborn baby and ordered the gatekeeper to bury the body. However, everything was revealed. In addition, during searches at Hamilton's place, valuables were found that she had stolen from the Empress. On March 14, 1719, Maria Hamilton was executed on the Trinity Square, having her head cut off. At the end of the 19th century, the Russian historian Mikhail Semyovsky tried to find containers with heads in the cellars of the Kunstkamera, but without success. According to one account, they were buried by order of Empress Catherine II. The head of Mons allegedly is still in the vaults of the Kunstkamera, but Hamilton's head mysteriously disappeared. So there is this account. One day, the head of the English spy and child killer Maria Hamilton, who was executed by orders of Czar Peter, disappeared from the museum along with the alcohol in which the head was stored. The loss of the alcohol was explained quite casually. Surely someone used it for its intended purpose. But the English sailors, whose ship was anchored right there, were immediately accused of stealing the head. The sailors did not deny it for a long time and promised to return Maria's head. And then they disappeared for the entire year. However, afterwards they returned to Russia and brought to the museum staff as many as 3 male heads. The exchange was recognized as equivalent because of that they were forgiven. Those British spies. Legends are legends, but if during a daytime visit to the Kunstkamera, visitors start feeling creepy when viewing some of the exhibits, what can we say about the nighttime, so beloved by ghosts and other evil spirits? The Kunstkamera number about 1.2 million exhibits, and are considered these exhibits are considered to be the most complete collections of artifacts that reveal the development of civilization. They are unique in their composition and have no analogues in European museums and museums of America. Undoubtedly, the priceless treasures of the Kunstkamera are the property of all mankind, but it was the Russia's emperor who thought of it. Those who come to look at the alcohol-soaked freaks and other artifacts of the Kunstkamera sometimes do not realize that in the courtyard around the flower bed, as if around a ritual temple, Indian, meaning Native American, stone idols, overgrown with many myths and legends, later debunked by historians, stand as if forgotten, stand in a ring. Why are statues, which are more than 1500 years old, hidden from prying eyes in the courtyard and not part of the main exhibition of the Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography of Peter the Great? And how did the foreign gods come to the city on the banks of the river Neva? For a long time it was believed that the idols were brought at the end of the 19th century, after one of the expeditions to Central America. However, on the way back, the ship got into a storm and lost most of the valuable finds. But the gods miraculously did not disappear in the ocean abyss and reached the city of the Russian Czar. Yes, only the stern academicians, adjusting their glasses and looking intently at the unfriendly faces of the overseas gods carved from stones, decided that it was not the place for them to show off in front of the public, and therefore placed them in a circle in the courtyard of the Kunstkamera. So they stand to this day, and they did not suffer either during the bloody revolutions of the beginning of the 20th century. They didn't suffer from the bombings by German National Socialist Luftwaffe during the siege of Leningrad in World War II. Did the idols bring ancient energy with them? Do the fans of extraordinary phenomena and psychics go there to worship at the place of power? Apparently so. They even began to give names to the deities, delving into Aztec theology. Here are Xipe Totec, the god of sowing and spring flowering, and Hushti-Suhuatl, the salt woman, the wife of the god of death, and Tlaloc, the grower, the god of rain and thunder, and Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, the god of night, cold, and witchcraft. Analogies can be traced if you turn to the sources, but did the Aztec gods form a sanctuary in the courtyard of the Kunstkamera? Well, it's time to debunk the myths. First of all, there was an expedition to America, only not to the Central, but to the South America. Stone idols worshipped by the vanished people were discovered in southern Colombia, in San Agustin Valley. They guarded the entrances to the underground tombs of the leaders, and some of the statues reach 5 meters in height. And in St. Petersburg, the idols are relatively small, 1.5 meters high at most. So what's the catch? Did Russia take the most compact ones? Not at all. A traveler named Stepel personally took plaster casts from huge statues in San Agustin. Either they really decided not to stir up the past and not to touch the statues of the unknown gods, or they just couldn't transport the cargo. Anyway, according to the casts of Stepel, concrete copies were made in Germany in Geiselberg and arrived in St. Petersburg in 1913. And since the statues of the deities, although they looked frightening and sinister, were in fact only copies of the original ancient idols from St. Augustine, the academicians did not want to put them on display. Why then did they order copies from the Germans? The idols were shoved into a barn where they survived the Russian Revolution again, and then the siege of Leningrad by German National Socialists, Nazis, and only in the 1960s of the last century, stone idols were taken out into the daylight, and it was decided to install them in the courtyard of the Kunstkamera, since it is unclear what to do with them. What else was the city government to do with the idols? Decorate the embankments of the city next to the sphinxes? The path to the secret sanctuary is guarded by 2 more idols, as if unfinished, compared to the rest of the brethren. So there are 7 silent idols standing around a broken flower bed, covered with the moss and darkening from the dampness of St. Petersburg. Rare lost visitors unknowingly believe that they are facing Aztec gods who simply did not find a place in the museum's exposition. And in order not to store antiquities in storerooms, they were put out in the street. The courtyard, by the way, is far from passable, so it's empty. So those walking along the university embankment do not even think about the mystical temple. So, although the beautiful and mystical legends did not turn out to be true, the stone idols of the Kunstkamera are a bright and formal attraction to St. Petersburg. And if you do your walking tour on the Vasilievsky Island, don't miss them. In 2014, the Kunstkamera celebrated its 300th anniversary. On November 24-25, 2014, the International Scientific Conference Kunstkamera, the first museum of Russia, 300 years of traditions and development, was held. On November 26, a solemn meeting was held dedicated to the 300th anniversary of the oldest scientific institutions in Russia. The first publicly accessible museum of Russia, the Kunstkamera, and the library of the Academy of Sciences. Russian President Vladimir Putin congratulated the Kunstkamera and the library of the Academy of Sciences on that anniversary. And let's look at the man responsible for it again. Described as handsome and of unusual physical strength, and standing at some 2 meters in height, Peter was literally head and shoulders above his contemporaries, both in Russia and of course in Europe. From his youth, Peter suffered from epileptic seizures, starting on the left side of the face. Initially a tremor, spasms and convulsions followed, ending with Peter losing consciousness. A beautiful servant, who later became his second wife, Catherine, would take Peter's head in her lap, stroking his hair and temples until he fell asleep. Peter's personality and legacy have been a source of much debate. He has left his large imprint on Russian history, science, culture, and foreign policy, but critics believe the changes were too brutal and costly to the Russian people. Moreover, the critics argue Russia was exposed too much to foreign influence, which replaced ancient ways and traditions. Yet, as the Russians speak of cutting a window through to Europe, which is synonymous with breakthrough or reforms, they are repeating Peter's mantra. Please stay tuned for more of my videos about the bloody and enigmatic 18th century, stories from the Russian Empire. Certainly, some very mysterious people left their footprints on the pages of the Russian history. And I'm not completely sure if we should speak about some of them in the past sense. I will bring forward those videos, and there's other research that I'm interested in, so you will see it. If you can support my research, you will see the links in the description to this video. Thank you for your attention. Please subscribe to my channel and ask others to do so.